The air was cold and heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something ancient, like time itself sealed in a tomb. 10-year-old Josiah Matthew Perkins knelt on the packed dirt floor, his small frame trembling not from the chill, but from the weight of the words he had just read. A single sliver of moonlight from the open trapdoor above illuminated the yellowed, brittle paper clutched in his dirt-stained hands. The ink, faded but clear, spoke of a prayer from a family long dead, a hope left buried for someone just like him, someone in desperate need. It was a message of kindness that had traversed nearly half a century to find him in this subterranean darkness. He read the final line again, "All that is here is yours, with our blessing." A dam of unspoken grief and loneliness, built over a year of cruelty and neglect, finally broke. He sank back against a rough wooden beam, the letter held to his chest, and began to sob, the sound echoing softly in the silence of the root cellar, not tears of sorrow but of being found. This is a story about how a single act of faith can echo through generations, and how hope can be found in the darkest of places. If you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. We are a community that cherishes tales of human resilience, and we would love to know where you are listening from today, so please drop a comment below. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful narratives to life, and I promise you, the journey of Josiah Matthew Perkins is one that will stay with you long after it ends. It is a testament to the quiet protectors who believe that even the forgotten children of the world deserve a chance at a better life, a chance to be seen and valued. But to understand the profound relief in those tears, and why a 43-year-old letter felt like a divine answer, we must travel back 1 year. We must go to the day the Nebraska sky turned a violent shade of grey and unleashed a hailstorm so fierce it seemed the heavens themselves were trying to shatter the earth. It was on that day that Josiah's world was ripped apart, when the storm took his parents and left him utterly alone. His journey to that cellar didn't begin with the strike of a hoe in the dirt, but with the deafening sound of ice striking the roof of his family's small wagon, an event that would set him on a path of hardship that would test the very limits of his will to survive. 1 year before, he would find himself kneeling in the dark. Josiah Matthew Perkins was a boy defined not by his age, but by the relentless Nebraska wind. It was a constant presence at the Wadsworth wheat farm, a sprawling, colorless expanse of land that seemed to drain the very blue from the sky. At 10 years old, his memories of a life before this place were becoming fragile, like sun-bleached photographs. He remembered the warmth of his mother's hand and the deep rumbling sound of his father's laughter. But those sensations were fading, replaced by the chill of the morning air in the barn and the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. The farm was less a home and more a sentence, a place where days were measured in the endless rows of wheat that stretched to a horizon he could never reach, and nights were marked by the heavy sound of a wooden bolt sliding into place, locking him and the other children in until dawn. His arrival had been a blur of muted colors and cold formalities. A stern-faced man from the county had driven him there in a rattling wagon, his words clipped and devoid of comfort. He had spoken of duty and providence, but Josiah had only felt the finality of being handed over, like a piece of luggage. The Wadsworths had accepted him with the same detached air. Mr. Wadsworth, a tall, skeletal man with eyes that saw everything and said nothing, had simply grunted. Mrs. Wadsworth, whose thin lips were perpetually pursed in a line of disapproval, had appraised his small frame and immediately assigned him to mucking out the stalls. There was no welcome, no kindness, only an immediate absorption into the farm's machinery of unpaid labor, a system fueled by the monthly stipend they received from the state for his care. Cornelius Wadsworth was a master of silent intimidation. He rarely raised his voice, for he had discovered long ago that the threat of violence was more potent than its execution. His presence was a weight that settled over the entire farm, pressing down on the children until they learned to move with a quiet, fearful efficiency. He would appear without a sound at the edge of a field or in the doorway of the barn, his shadow falling over them long before they were aware of his proximity. A slow, deliberate nod was a warning. A lingering gaze was a condemnation. The children learned to read these subtle cues as a matter of survival, understanding that any infraction, no matter how small, would be met with a punishment that was always swift and disproportionately severe. His silence was not peaceful. It was a coiled serpent, always ready to strike. If Cornelius was the silent threat, his wife Martha was the architect of their daily misery. She was a woman who wielded nourishment as a weapon, believing that a hungry child was a compliant child. The meals she served were a calculated cruelty, a thin, watery stew with a few lonely vegetables floating in a greasy broth, and a single slice of stale bread that was more crust than crumb. She would watch them eat, her eyes sharp and critical, taking a perverse satisfaction in their desperate, hurried bites. Spilling a drop of water or speaking out of turn could mean losing that meager portion entirely. For Martha, control was paramount, and she had discovered that the most effective way to break a child's spirit was to first break their body with hunger, ensuring they were too weak to dream of defiance or escape. Josiah was one of 7 children on the farm, but he was profoundly alone. They were a scattered constellation of quiet suffering, a collection of ghosts who moved through their chores with downcast eyes and hunched shoulders. There was little camaraderie among them, as the constant competition for the barest scraps of food and the avoidance of punishment had eroded any sense of solidarity. They were too exhausted, too hungry, and too afraid to form bonds. They were like individual saplings in a harsh wind, each bending under the strain, unable to offer support to the others. This isolation was perhaps the cruelest part of the Wadsworth system. It ensured that each child bore their burden in solitude, convinced that they were the only one feeling the crushing weight of their despair. The rhythm of his life was dictated by the sun and the demands of the farm. He would wake in the pre-dawn chill of the barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and animal sweat, his body aching from a night spent on a thin bed of straw. The days were a relentless cycle of hard labor. He hauled buckets of water from the well until his arms felt like they would detach from his shoulders. He turned the soil in the vegetable garden with a hoe that was almost as tall as he was, and he weeded endless fields under a sun that beat down without mercy. There was no rest, no pause, only a brief stop for the midday gruel before being sent back out to the fields. By the time evening came, he would be so tired that the act of walking back to the barn felt like a monumental effort. Hunger became his most intimate companion. It was a dull, constant ache in the pit of his stomach, a physical presence that clouded his thoughts and stole the vibrancy from the world. He started to forget the taste of real food, the memory of a ripe apple or a piece of his mother's honey cake becoming a distant dream. The gnawing emptiness made him weak, his movements slow and clumsy, which only earned him more of Martha Wadsworth's sharp-tongued rebukes. He learned to ignore the pain, to push it down into a dark corner of his mind, but it was always there, a reminder of his powerlessness, a constant physical manifestation of the neglect that defined his existence on that desolate stretch of prairie. In the deepest recesses of the night, when the only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks in the barn walls, Josiah would allow himself to remember. He would conjure the image of his father tossing him into the air, his own squeals of delight mixing with the man's deep, hearty laugh. He would remember the scent of cinnamon and cloves that always clung to his mother's apron, and the feeling of safety he felt when she wrapped her arms around him. These memories were a secret treasure, a small, warm light he nurtured in the cold darkness of his reality. They were dangerous, because they reminded him of everything he had lost. But they were also essential. They were the proof that a different world had once existed, a world of love and kindness. And this proof was the only thing that kept a tiny, flickering ember of hope alive within him. The barn itself was a cage, cold and drafty, offering little protection from the elements. Moonlight would filter through the gaps between the wooden slats, creating eerie patterns on the hay-strewn floor. At night, every creak of the old wood, every rustle of a mouse in the hay, sounded amplified and menacing. The heavy bolt on the outside of the door was a constant physical reminder of his captivity. He and the other children were livestock, penned in for the night, their worth measured only by the labor they could provide the next day. He would often lie awake for hours, listening to the lonely howl of the wind, feeling as if the sound was a reflection of the silent scream trapped inside his own chest. Yet even in this bleak existence, Josiah's spirit had not been entirely extinguished. He possessed a quiet, observant nature that the Wadsworths mistook for simple obedience. He noticed things, The way a floorboard near the back of the barn was slightly looser than the others, the pattern of Mr. Wadsworth's nightly rounds, the precise moment when Mrs. Wadsworth was most distracted by her bookkeeping. These small details were filed away in his mind, not as part of a conscious plan, but as an instinct for survival. He would trace the intricate patterns of a spiderweb in the corner of the barn, or count the distant stars visible through a crack in the roof, small mental exercises to keep his mind sharp and focused. It was a subtle, unconscious act of resistance, a refusal to let the monotony and cruelty of his life erase the boy he was meant to be. The isolation of the Wadsworth farm was absolute. It was miles from the nearest town, and the few neighbors they had kept to themselves, unwilling to interfere. The county official who had dropped him off never returned to check on his well-being. It was as if Josiah had been dropped off the edge of the world, forgotten by everyone who had once known him. This sense of being utterly abandoned was a heavy cloak, and there were days when he felt it might suffocate him. He understood with the grim clarity of a child forced to grow up too soon that no one was coming to save him. If he was to survive, it would have to be through his own strength, a resource that felt perilously close to running out with each passing day. The shift from a chronic gnawing hunger to a deliberate sentence of starvation began on a Tuesday morning, under a sky the color of faded denim. The air was already thick with the coming heat of the day, and Josiah's arms trembled from the effort of carrying 2 heavy buckets of milk from the milking shed to the main house. He had been up since before dawn, his small body already aching with a fatigue that had seeped into his bones over the past year. The metal handles of the buckets dug into his palms, the skin already raw and calloused. He moved with the slow, careful shuffle of someone trying to conserve every last ounce of energy. His focus narrowed to the simple, desperate task of not spilling a single drop. The ground was uneven, rutted by the wheels of the farm wagon, and each step was a calculated risk, a small battle against gravity and his own growing weakness. The accident happened with a sickening finality. One of his worn-out shoes caught on an exposed tree root, and for a heart-stopping second, he fought to regain his balance, his body lurching forward. The weight of the milk, sloshing violently, was too much. The right bucket slipped from his grasp, his fingers too weak to hold on. It hit the packed dirt with a loud metallic clang, and a wave of white liquid splashed across the ground, soaking into the thirsty earth in a matter of seconds. An unnatural silence immediately fell over the farmyard. The chirping of crickets seemed to cease. The distant lowing of a cow died in the air. Josiah froze, his eyes wide with terror, staring at the spreading white stain on the dark ground. He could feel the cold, impassive gaze of Cornelius Wadsworth from the porch, a silent judgment that was more terrifying than any shout. Martha Wadsworth emerged from the house not with haste, but with a slow, deliberate cadence that amplified the tension in the air. She wiped her hands on her apron, her movements precise and unhurried as she walked towards him. Her face was a mask of cold fury, her thin lips pressed into a line so tight they seemed to disappear. She didn't look at the spilled milk. She looked directly at Josiah, her eyes like chips of ice. There was a predatory stillness about her, the calm of a spider approaching a fly caught in its web. She stopped just a few feet from him, and the world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them, the small, trembling boy and the woman who held absolute power over his existence. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but he knew instinctively that words would be useless. They would only be seen as an excuse, a further transgression. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it cut through the morning air with the sharpness of a razor. "You are careless, boy," she said, the words clipped and devoid of any emotion save for a cold, simmering contempt. "Property has value here. Labor has value. You have wasted both." She paused, letting the weight of her accusation settle on his small shoulders. Then she delivered the sentence, her tone as flat and final as a judge's gavel. "You will learn its value. 3 days. No food. Not a crust of bread, not a drop of stew, only water. We will see how careful you are when your own belly pays the price for your clumsiness." The threat was not a fit of anger. It was a calculated decree, a formal declaration of his punishment, delivered with an unnerving sense of righteousness. A wave of cold dread washed over Josiah, so intense it made him feel dizzy. 3 days. The words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of his mind. It wasn't just missing a few meals. On the Wadsworth farm it was a death sentence for the spirit. He knew better than to cry or beg. He had seen another boy, Peter, do so after breaking the handle of a shovel, and Martha had added a day to his punishment for what she called insolent theatrics. Josiah simply stood there, his head bowed, the sun beating down on his neck. He could feel the eyes of the other children on him, their gazes a mixture of pity and fear. Pity for him, and fear that it could just as easily have been them. He understood in that moment that the punishment was not just for him, it was a lesson for all of them, a brutal reinforcement of the farm's unwritten laws. He remembered what had happened to a girl named Sarah just 2 months prior. She had been caught taking a handful of raw peas from the garden, her hunger having driven her to a moment of desperate defiance. Her punishment had been 2 days of starvation. Josiah had watched her wither, her already thin frame seeming to shrink, her eyes becoming hollow and vacant. On the second day she had collapsed in the field, too weak to stand. Mr. Wadsworth had carried her back to the barn like a sack of grain and tossed her onto the straw where she had remained, barely moving, until her sentence was over. The image of her pale, listless face was burned into his memory. Now, that same fate awaited him, but for 3 days, not 2, an entire extra day of emptiness, of his body consuming itself. The rest of the morning passed in a surreal haze. Martha Wadsworth sent him to the far end of the property to weed the sprawling vegetable garden, a task that required hours of back-breaking work under the relentless Nebraska sun. The hoe felt impossibly heavy in his hands, and each movement sent a fresh wave of dizziness through him. The hunger, which had been a dull, constant ache, now sharpened into a throbbing, urgent pain. It was no longer just a physical sensation, it was a psychological weight, a constant reminder of his sentence. He could feel the sun leaching the last of his strength, the heat baking the moisture from his body, and he knew this was only the beginning. He had 72 hours of this emptiness to endure. At midday, the bell rang for lunch. Josiah watched from the field as the other children lined up for their meager portion of watery gruel. He was not allowed to stop working. The sound of their spoons, scraping against the tin bowls, drifted across the yard, each scrape an act of exquisite torture. He gripped the handle of his hoe, his knuckles white, and forced himself to focus on the weeds in front of him, yanking them from the dry soil with a ferocity born of despair. He would not give Martha Wadsworth the satisfaction of seeing him break. But inside, a cold, hard knot of fear was tightening in his stomach. He was already weak. How could he possibly survive 3 full days of hard labor with nothing to sustain him? That night, locked in the barn, the reality of his situation settled in completely. The other children kept their distance, as if his punishment were a contagious disease. He lay on his thin bed of straw, his stomach cramping with a pain so intense it made him gasp. He drank water from the communal bucket, but it did nothing to quell the gnawing emptiness. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the barn, every rustle in the hay seemed to amplify his isolation. He stared up at the slivers of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the roof, counting them over and over to keep his mind from spiraling into panic. He thought of his parents, of the feeling of being safe and loved, and the memory was so painful it felt like a physical blow. The second day dawned with a sense of grim finality. When Josiah tried to stand, the world tilted violently, and black spots danced in front of his eyes. A profound weakness had taken root in his limbs, making every movement a monumental effort. His thoughts felt slow and thick, as if his brain were wading through molasses. Cornelius Wadsworth merely pointed him toward the backyard, a patch of sun-scorched earth near the main house that was overrun with tough, stringy weeds. Josiah stumbled out into the morning light, his body feeling hollow and disconnected, a fragile shell on the verge of shattering. The sun was already climbing, promising another day of merciless heat. He worked in a stupor, his movements mechanical and clumsy. The world had lost its sharp edges, blurring into a shimmering, indistinct haze. The sounds of the farm, a rooster crowing, the distant clang of a hammer, seemed to come from very far away. He was acutely aware of the passage of time, of the hours stretching before him like a barren desert. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he might not have the strength to see the end of his punishment. The threat Martha Wadsworth had made was no longer a future consequence. It was a present and active force, consuming him from the inside out, draining the very life from his body with each passing empty moment. It was in the suffocating darkness of that second night, lying on the scratchy straw, that the decision finally crystallized. It wasn't a brave choice born of defiance, but a desperate calculation made in the face of annihilation. The hunger was no longer an ache. It had become a living thing inside him, a cold creature with sharp claws tearing at his insides. He could feel his own body betraying him, his thoughts growing sluggish and his limbs heavy with a weakness that felt like the beginning of the end. He knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the packed earth floor beneath him, that he would not survive a third day. The memory of the hoe striking wood, that dull, hollow thud, returned to him not as a simple curiosity, but as the only sound in the world that mattered. It was a single fragile note of possibility in a symphony of despair, and he clung to it as a drowning man clings to a splinter of wood. Staying in the barn was a death sentence. Whatever lay buried in that yard was a chance. The fear was a physical presence, a cold weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He imagined being caught, the feel of Cornelius Wadsworth's heavy hand on his shoulder, the look in Martha's eyes as she devised a punishment far worse than starvation. The images were so vivid they made him tremble, but then he imagined the alternative, lying here, growing weaker and weaker, until the world simply faded to black. He weighed the two possibilities, the terror of being caught against the quiet horror of giving up. For the first time in a year, he felt a flicker of agency, a sense that he could choose his own fate, even if both choices led to potential ruin. He would rather face the monster in the open than let the one inside him win. This was his point of no return. The decision to act, to risk everything, was the first real meal his spirit had tasted in months. He forced his clouded mind to focus, to listen. For a year, he had absorbed the nightly rhythm of the farm as a matter of survival, learning the language of its creaks and groans. Now he listened with a new, sharp intent. He catalogued the sounds, the settling of the old farmhouse, the rustle of mice in the hay, the soft, troubled breathing of the other children. He waited for the crucial signal, the one he had learned to anticipate. First came the heavy, rhythmic creak of the floorboards above the kitchen as Mr. Wadsworth made his final check, followed by the definitive thud of his boots being dropped by the bedside. Then, after what felt like an eternity, came the sound that was both his lock and his key, the deep, rumbling snore of Cornelius Wadsworth, a sound so consistent and profound it seemed to shake the very walls of the house. That was his window, the deepest point of the night, when the world was most asleep. His plan was a thing of desperate simplicity. He would use the loose board at the back of the barn, a flaw in his prison he had discovered weeks ago but had never dared to use. He would crawl out, keeping low to the ground, and make his way to the spot behind the house. He had no tools, only his hands, but they would have to be enough. He pictured himself digging, scraping at the dry, compacted earth, his fingers raw and bleeding. He did not allow himself to think about what he might find or what he might not. The focus had to be on the process, on each small, deliberate movement. He mentally rehearsed the path, counting the steps from the barn to the weedy patch, visualizing the way the moonlight would cast long, distorted shadows across the yard. This mental exercise was a shield, a way to keep the overwhelming fear at bay by breaking an impossible task into a series of small, manageable actions. Before he moved, his gaze swept across the darkened barn, lingering for a moment on the other sleeping children. He could just make out their shapes, small, fragile lumps huddled under thin blankets. He saw Sarah, her breath a shallow whisper, and Peter, who still flinched in his sleep. A wave of guilt washed over him, a selfish feeling for leaving them behind in this place of shared misery. But it was followed by a cold, hard resolve. He could not carry them. He could barely carry himself. To save any of them, he first had to save himself. This silent farewell was not to them as individuals, but to the shared identity of victimhood. He was shedding that skin tonight, for better or for worse. He was choosing to be more than just one of the Wadsworth orphans. He was choosing to be Josiah again, a boy who would fight for his own life. The trigger came just as he knew it would. From the main house, faint but clear, the chime of the grandfather clock struck 2. The sound was the starting pistol for his race against time. He pushed himself to a sitting position, and the world swam violently, the barn's rafters seeming to twist and bend. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting back the wave of nausea and dizziness. His body screamed in protest, every muscle aching, every joint on fire. Moving felt like tearing something vital within himself. He crawled on his hands and knees, the straw pricking his skin, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Each foot of progress was a victory of will over physical collapse. He reached the back wall, his fingers finding the familiar rough edges of the loose board, his heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. He pulled at the board, trying to ease it from its place without a sound. But the old wood, swollen with dampness, resisted. He applied more pressure, his weak arms trembling with the strain. It finally gave way with a low, groaning creak that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the profound silence of the night. He froze instantly, every muscle tensed, his ears straining for any sound from the house. He waited, not daring to breathe, convinced he would see the yellow glow of a lantern and hear the heavy footsteps of Mr. Wadsworth. The silence stretched on, thick and absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of his own heart. A full minute passed, then another. Nothing. The farm slept on, oblivious. He had not been discovered. He had faced his first test and survived. With painstaking slowness, he slid the board aside and squeezed his thin body through the narrow opening. The rough edges of the wood scraped against his back, a sharp, stinging pain that barely registered through the haze of hunger. Then he was outside. The night air was cool and crisp, a shocking contrast to the stuffy, stale air of the barn. It felt electric on his skin, waking senses that had been dulled by exhaustion and despair. He was exposed, a small, solitary figure under a vast, star-dusted sky. He looked back at the dark silhouette of the barn, his prison, and then forward into the shadows of the yard. There was no going back through that opening. The bolt on the main door was secure. His only path was forward now, toward a small patch of earth that held the sum of all his hope and all his fear. Crawling out from under the barn was like being born into a world of sharp edges and cold truths. The night air, so different from the stale, dusty atmosphere of his prison, was a physical shock against his feverish skin. It was thin and carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain, a smell of freedom so potent it was almost painful. For a moment, he simply knelt on the ground, his small frame trembling, a solitary figure adrift in a sea of shadows. The farmhouse stood as a dark, sleeping giant against a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars. Every window was a blind eye, but he felt watched nonetheless. His first few steps were a test of his own will, each movement a negotiation with muscles that screamed in protest and a mind clouded by the fog of starvation. He felt fragile, as if a strong gust of wind could shatter him into 1,000 pieces. The yard was a treacherous landscape. The moonlight, which had seemed a blessing through the cracks in the barn, was now a threat, bleaching the ground in stark white patches and leaving pools of impenetrable blackness. He understood instinctively that the shadows were his only allies. He moved in a low crouch, a ghost flitting from the dark outline of the water trough to the deeper shadow cast by a lone skeletal oak tree. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat counting down the seconds he had until discovery. He imagined a curtain twitching in an upstairs window, the glint of Mr. Wadsworth's spectacles in the darkness. The fear was a living thing coiling in his gut, but his determination was a small hard stone at its center, a focal point of resolve in the overwhelming terror. He nearly fell just once, his bare foot, clumsy with exhaustion, snagged on an exposed root, the same kind of simple obstacle that had cost him his meager meals. His body pitched forward, and a choked gasp escaped his lips as he threw his hands out to break the fall. He caught himself just inches from the ground, his palms stinging as they scraped against the packed earth. The world tilted and swam, the familiar dizziness returning with a vengeance. For a terrifying second, he was back in the morning sun, watching the white milk soak into the dirt, hearing Martha's cold-clipped voice pronounce his sentence. The memory was a physical blow, but it also served as a spur. He pushed himself back up, his breathing ragged, the near fall a brutal reminder of what he stood to lose. This time, he would not be defeated by a simple misstep. When he finally reached the patch of weedy ground behind the house, the momentary relief was immediately swallowed by the sheer impossibility of the task before him. The earth was dry and hard, baked into a solid crust by the relentless summer sun. He had no shovel, no trowel, nothing but his own 2 hands. He knelt, the rough ground digging into his knees, and stared at the spot where his hoe had made that strange, hollow sound. It looked no different from any other part of the yard. A wave of doubt, cold and sickening, washed over him. What if he had imagined it? What if this was all a pointless, desperate fantasy, born of hunger and delirium? He looked at his hands, small and thin, the fingers already raw from his work on the farm. They seemed utterly inadequate for the violence he was about to inflict upon the earth. He began to dig. The initial shock of pain was breathtaking. The compacted soil was like sandpaper, tearing at his fingertips, filling the space beneath his nails with grit and agony. He scraped and clawed, his movements weak and inefficient, dislodging little more than dust and small pebbles with each desperate effort. After only a few minutes, his fingers were raw and bleeding, the sting of the torn skin a sharp counterpoint to the dull ache in his stomach. He had to stop, curling into a tight ball, pressing his wounded hands to his chest, and biting down hard on his lower lip to stifle a sob. The hopelessness was a physical weight, pressing him down, whispering that he should just give up, crawl away, and accept his fate. It would be so much easier to simply lie down and let the world fade away. But then the image of Martha Wadsworth's face swam in his mind's eye, her lips pursed in that thin line of cruel satisfaction. He thought of her voice, flat and final, as she condemned him to 3 days of nothingness. That memory ignited a spark of defiance in the cold emptiness of his belly. He would not give her the satisfaction of breaking him. He would not die in her barn. This was not just a search for a buried secret, it was a rebellion against the slow, methodical erasure of his own existence. He uncurled his body and changed his tactics, driven by a new, cold fury. He began using the heels of his hands to hammer at the hard ground, breaking up the crust, and then used his fingers like claws to scoop the loosened dirt away. It was agonizing, brutal work, but it was progress. Suddenly a sound cut through the night, sharp and clear. A dog barking from a neighboring farm, a single interrogative woof that hung in the silent air before being swallowed by the darkness. Josiah froze, every muscle in his body locking into place. His blood ran cold. The sound seemed impossibly loud, a gunshot in the dead of night. He was certain it would be enough to stir someone in the house. He flattened himself to the ground, trying to make himself as small as possible, his ears straining, listening for the creak of a floorboard, the scrape of a match, the heavy tread of Mr. Wadsworth's boots. The silence that followed the bark was more terrifying than the sound itself, a void filled with his own frantic heartbeat and the rush of blood in his ears. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe. The farm remained silent, the house remained dark. The dog did not bark again. It had been nothing, a random sound in the night, meaningless to anyone but him. The wave of adrenaline that had flooded his system left him shaking, but it also sharpened his senses and instilled a new, desperate urgency. He could not afford to waste another second. The moon had already begun its slow descent across the sky, a silent clock ticking away his limited time. He returned to his work with a frantic energy, his hands a blur of motion, scraping and scooping, ignoring the fire in his fingertips. He was no longer just digging. He was racing against the dawn, a race for his very life. His bleeding fingers finally struck something that was not earth, not stone. It was a flat, hard surface that gave a dull, resonant thud under his frantic scraping. Wood. The sensation shot up his arm, a jolt of pure, unadulterated confirmation. It was real. He hadn't imagined it. A surge of strength he didn't know he possessed flooded his limbs. He abandoned all caution, tearing at the remaining soil with a wild, desperate energy. He clawed at the edges, his mind focused on a single goal, to uncover what lay beneath. Slowly, the outline of a large, dark square began to emerge from the pale dirt. It was a heavy wooden lid, its planks weathered and grey, held together by strips of rusted iron. He had found it. He had actually found it. As he cleared the last of the dirt away, his fingers brushed against something cold and circular. An iron ring, set flush into the wood, a handle for whatever lay below. The sight of it made his breath catch in his throat. It was a tangible link to a past he couldn't comprehend, a promise of something other than the barren reality he knew. But his brief moment of triumph was immediately extinguished by a new, crushing despair. The trapdoor was huge, far heavier than he had anticipated, and it was sunk deep into the ground. He looked at his own thin, trembling arms, at his small, exhausted body, and knew with a sickening certainty that he didn't have the strength to lift it. To have come this far, to have risked everything, only to be defeated by his own physical weakness, was a cruelty too great to bear. He gripped the cold iron ring with both hands, planting his feet in the loose dirt. He pulled, summoning every last ounce of his dwindling energy. His muscles screamed, his tendons felt like they were tearing, and the world began to shrink to a narrow tunnel of black. The door didn't move. It was as if it were fused to the very bedrock of the earth. He fell back, gasping for air, tears of frustration and rage stinging his eyes. He refused to fail. He repositioned himself, digging his heels in, trying to use the leverage of his entire body. He pulled again, a raw, guttural cry tearing from his throat, a sound of pure, primal effort. The old wood groaned in protest, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground and up into his very bones. He let go, collapsing onto his back, certain that this time he had finally woken the dead. But the world remained asleep. The groan had been the protest of ancient wood, not an alarm bell. He lay on the ground, his chest heaving, his body a single throbbing ache. He knew he had only one more attempt in him before his strength failed completely. This was it. He struggled back to his knees, his vision blurry, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the cool night air. He wrapped his bloody fingers around the iron ring one last time, focusing all his will, all his pain, all his hope into this single, final action. He closed his eyes and pulled, not with the strength of his body, which was all but gone, but with the desperate, unyielding force of his spirit, the part of him that refused to die in this forgotten patch of dirt. With a final, desperate cry that was more air than sound, the heavy wooden door shifted. It didn't swing open, but scraped sideways, with a deep, groaning protest of ancient timber being disturbed after a long, silent slumber. The sound vibrated through the ground and up into Josiah's bones, a resonance from a time he couldn't imagine. From the dark gap, a breath of air rose to meet him, cool and heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient, like time itself, sealed in a tomb. It was a stark, shocking contrast to the hot, oppressive air of the Nebraska night. He stared into the absolute blackness, his heart a frantic bird in his chest. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now intertwined with an irresistible pull, a sense that he had breached the wall between his world of suffering and another of profound mystery. He used the last of his strength to shove the heavy lid aside, just enough to create an opening for his small body to slip through. The edge of the wood was rough and splintered against his back as he lowered himself into the void. His bare feet found the top of a set of stone steps, the surface cold and surprisingly even under his soles. He paused there for a moment, his head still in the world above, the world of moonlight and crickets and the sleeping monstrous house. Then he took the first step down, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The sliver of moonlight vanished as his body descended below the level of the ground, plunging him into a blackness so complete it felt like a physical substance. The air grew cooler with each step, the smell of rich soil and subterranean stillness growing stronger, wiping away the scent of the dry, dusty farm above. He was leaving the world of the Wadsworths behind, one careful step at a time. When his feet finally touched a solid, packed earth floor, the silence that enveloped him was unlike any he had ever known. It wasn't the tense, watchful quiet of the barn, where every creak was a potential threat. This was a deep, undisturbed peace, the silence of a place that had been forgotten by the world for generations. He stood perfectly still, his body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline, waiting for his eyes to adjust. It was a slow, painful process, the darkness yielding its secrets with grudging reluctance. He could hear nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic, hopeful drumming of his own heart. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he was truly completely alone, and the feeling was not one of loneliness, but of sanctuary. He had found a pocket of the world that his tormentors did not know existed. Extending a shaky hand, he reached out into the void until his fingertips brushed against a rough-hewn wooden surface. He traced its texture, feeling the grain of the wood, the coolness of it. He took a few shuffling steps forward, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance, his other held out in front of him. The air was a physical comfort, a cool balm against his feverish skin, soothing the raw scrapes on his hands and the sunburnt sting on the back of his neck. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the clean, earthy scent. It was the first breath he had taken in a year that did not feel stolen, the first that was not tainted by the smell of hay, manure, and despair. In this subterranean chamber, hidden from the merciless sun and the equally merciless eyes of his keepers, he felt a profound, almost unbelievable sense of physical relief. As his vision slowly sharpened, the faint sliver of light from the partially open trapdoor became a beacon, casting a single narrow beam into the gloom. It was just enough to reveal the shapes that surrounded him. He was in a small rectangular room, and lining the walls were shelves, dozens of them, stretching from the floor to the low ceiling. He stumbled towards the nearest one, his hand brushing against something cool and smooth. Glass. His fingers wrapped around the curved surface of a sealed jar. He could just make out the dark shapes suspended within. He moved his hand to the next, and the next. They were everywhere. Hundreds of them, it seemed, their surfaces coated in a thin layer of dust. The realization dawned on him not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, rising tide of disbelief. This was a root cellar, a pantry, a place of impossible abundance buried just a few feet beneath the yard where he was being systematically starved. He moved deeper into the cellar, a small ghost drifting through a forgotten treasure trove. The faint moonlight revealed the outlines of large wooden barrels pushed against the far wall and two heavy cedar chests sitting in a corner, their iron hinges dark with rust. The sheer scale of the provision was staggering, far beyond what any single family would need for a single winter. This wasn't just a larder, it was a meticulously planned fortress against famine, a testament to a level of foresight and fear he could barely comprehend. It felt like a dream, a delirious hallucination brought on by his profound hunger. He half expected to wake up on the scratchy straw of the barn, the cold reality of his punishment crashing back down on him. But the cool, solid glass of a jar in his hand was real, the earthy smell was real, and the profound silence was real. He did not immediately pry open a jar and devour its contents. The shock of the discovery was too great, paralyzing him where he stood. He was in the center of the small room, turning in a slow circle, his mind struggling to reconcile this reality with the one he had just escaped. This place was a perfect photographic negative of his life on the Wadsworth farm. Where they cultivated scarcity, here was impossible abundance. Where they offered only cruelty and neglect, this place offered preservation and sustenance. It was a direct physical refutation of their entire world. The existence of this cellar felt like a judgment against them, a secret sanctuary of hope that had been waiting patiently beneath their feet all along, a silent witness to their calculated wickedness. It was during his slow, disbelieving survey of the room that the single beam of moonlight caught something out of place. Tacked to a thick central support beam that held up the low ceiling was a small, pale rectangle. It was not a label for a shelf or an inventory list. It was something different, something placed there with intention, meant to be seen. A single sheet of paper, yellowed by the passage of decades, held in place by a single dark iron tack. His gaze fixed on it, a new kind of curiosity cutting through the fog of his hunger and exhaustion. The food was for the body, but this, he sensed instinctively, was something for the soul. It was a message, a voice from the silent past that had built this incredible refuge. He approached the wooden beam with a sense of reverence, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. A different kind of fear surfaced now, not the terror of being caught, but a deep, trembling awe. This felt more significant than all the jars of food combined. This was the heart of the cellar, the reason for its existence. His hand was shaking uncontrollably as he reached out, his dirt-stained, bleeding fingers gently brushing against the brittle, fragile edges of the paper. It felt as delicate as a dried leaf in autumn. With painstaking care, he worked the old tack loose from the wood, freeing the letter. The small piece of metal felt heavy in his palm, a tangible link to the person who had hammered it into this beam so very long ago. He knelt on the packed dirt floor, his small frame trembling not from the chill, but from the weight of the words he had just begun to read. The single sliver of moonlight from the open trapdoor above illuminated the yellowed, brittle paper clutched in his hands. The ink, faded but clear, spoke of a prayer from a family long dead, a hope left buried for someone just like him, someone in desperate need. It was a message of kindness that had traversed nearly half a century to find him in this subterranean darkness. He read the final line again, "All that is here is yours, with our blessing." A dam of unspoken grief and loneliness, built over a year of cruelty and neglect, finally broke. He sank back against a rough wooden beam, the letter held to his chest, and began to sob. The sound echoing softly in the silence of the root cellar, not tears of sorrow but of being found. The paper in his hands was more than just old. It felt like a relic, a fragment of a forgotten world. It was impossibly fragile, the edges soft and crumbling, and it carried a faint dry scent of dust and time. As he held it in the single, narrow shaft of moonlight, the words seemed to emerge from the yellowed fibers not as ink, but as a whispered voice from the past. The script was elegant and precise, each letter formed with a careful, deliberate hand, a stark contrast to the hurried, functional world he knew. He traced the name at the top, Johansson Family Homestead, Spring 1847, and a shiver ran through him that had nothing to do with the cellar's chill. 43 years. This message had been waiting here in the darkness for 43 years, patiently guarding its secrets, while the world above changed and churned, while empires rose and fell, and while a boy named Josiah Matthew Perkins was not yet even a dream. He began to read, his lips moving silently, sounding out the unfamiliar words in the quiet of his mind. The letter started simply, a practical introduction from a man named Eric Johansson. He wrote of the land, of the first successful wheat harvest, and of his pride in the cellar they had built with their own hands. He described it as a bastion against the unpredictability of the Nebraska prairie, a fortress to protect his wife Anna, and their two children, Carl and Sophia, from the brutal winters and the rumored raids that never came. The tone was one of sturdy, pragmatic faith, the voice of a man who believed in hard work, in foresight, and in the responsibility of a father to protect his family against any conceivable threat. It was a language of care and provision that Josiah had almost forgotten existed, a stark and painful contrast to the calculated neglect of the Wadsworths. Then the tone of the letter began to shift. The confident, practical voice of the patriarch started to fray at the edges, replaced by a note of quiet, creeping dread. Eric wrote of a sickness that had arrived in the county, a scarlet fever that moved from farm to farm like a phantom, leaving silence in its wake. He described the fear in the nearby town, the closed doors, the hushed conversations. He wrote of their own decision to isolate themselves, to trust in the provisions they had so carefully stored, to wait out the invisible storm. There was a palpable sense of a world shrinking, of a family turning inward, their carefully constructed fortress becoming their final, inescapable prison. Josiah could feel the hope draining from the words, the ink itself seeming to darken with a sorrow that transcended the decades. The next lines were a confession of defeat, a surrender to a force they could not fight. Eric wrote that the fever had found them. Little Sophia had been taken first, her passing described with a grief so raw and profound that Josiah felt a sympathetic ache in his own chest. Then Carl had fallen ill. The letter became a testament to a father's helplessness, watching his family be dismantled by an enemy he could not see or strike. He wrote of his wife Anna's unwavering strength, even as her own health began to fail, her final days spent tending to her son. Josiah could almost picture the scene, a man alone in his farmhouse, the silence of his home growing deeper and more absolute with each passing day, writing these final words by the light of a flickering candle as his own life ebbed away. Josiah's hands trembled so violently that he had to brace the paper against his knee to continue reading. He felt a profound connection to this man he had never known, a shared experience of devastating, world-altering loss. He, too, knew the silence that followed a storm, the emptiness of a home once filled with love. He read of Eric's final realization that he, too, was succumbing to the fever, that his own time was short. He described his last act, tacking this letter to the support beam in the cellar, a final message sent out into an unknown future. The words were no longer just a historical account, they were a direct and personal testament, a bridge of human experience built across nearly half a century of time, connecting one man's final moments to a lost boy's desperate present. It was the final paragraph that shattered him. The words, though faded, seemed to burn with an intensity that lit up the dark cellar. Erik Johansson, in the last hours of his life, had turned his thoughts not to his own sorrow, but to a stranger. He wrote of a prayer, a final desperate plea he had made to God. He prayed that the fruits of his family's labor, this cellar filled with the hope of their future, would not go to waste. He prayed that one day, long after they were gone and forgotten, someone in desperate need would be led to this place. He prayed for a child, a traveler, a soul lost on the prairie, that they might find this shelter and in it find the strength to continue. The words were a direct expression of a faith so pure and selfless it was almost incomprehensible to Josiah. Then came the final lines, the ones that felt as if they were spoken directly to him and only to him. To whomever finds this shelter, Erik had written, his handwriting growing slightly weaker, yet still clear. We have prepared this in prayer that God might send someone in need long after we are gone. If you are reading this, our prayers have been answered. Josiah read the words once, then twice, his mind struggling to grasp their full, staggering weight. He was not an accident. His discovery was not a coincidence. He was the answer to a prayer offered up by a dying man 43 years ago. The thought was so immense, so overwhelming, it felt like the entire weight of the Nebraska sky was pressing down on him, not with cruelty, but with a grace so profound it buckled his knees. He looked around the cellar, at the shelves packed with jars, at the barrels and the chests. This was not just food. This was a legacy of kindness. This was an inheritance of hope. Each jar of pickles, each bag of beans, was a physical manifestation of a family's love, preserved and passed down through time. The Johanssons had faced the end of their world, not with bitterness or despair, but with a final defiant act of generosity. They had planted a seed of hope in the earth, and 43 years later, in his moment of absolute desperation, he was the one to find its fruit. He was the harvest they had prayed for. The realization was a tidal wave of emotion that crashed over the dam he had so carefully constructed over the past year. The sob started as a silent tremor in his chest, a convulsion of his small, starved frame. Then a sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged cry that was swallowed by the deep, earthy silence of the cellar. He sank back against the rough wooden beam, the letter clutched to his chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, streaming down his dirt-streaked face. They were not the tears of a hungry boy, or a lonely boy, or an abused boy. They were the tears of a boy who had just been found. He cried for the year of believing he was worthless, for the nights spent feeling utterly forgotten by the world. He cried for the cruelty of the Wadsworths, which now seemed so small and pathetic in the face of this monumental act of goodness. He wept for the Johansson family, for their lost lives and their beautiful, enduring legacy. He mourned for little Sophia and Carl, children he had never met, but now felt he knew. He grieved for Erik and Anna, for the future they had planned and would never see. But mixed with the sorrow was a feeling of overwhelming gratitude that was so powerful it felt like it might tear him apart. He was not alone. He had never been alone. Through the darkest days of his life, a prayer had been traveling toward him, a whisper of hope that had been waiting patiently beneath his feet. In the absolute darkness of a forgotten cellar, Josiah Matthew Perkins was finally truly seen. He sat there for a long time, the storm of emotions slowly subsiding into a profound and quiet calm. The tears had washed away more than just the grime from his face. They had cleansed a deeper wound inside him, the one that had convinced him he was unlovable and invisible. The letter was proof to the contrary. It was a signed, dated, and delivered testament that kindness was real, that goodness could endure even beyond death, and that even a forgotten orphan shivering in a barn was worthy of a prayer. The knowledge settled into his soul, a warm, solid weight that displaced the cold, gnawing emptiness of hunger and despair. He was no longer just a victim of the Wadsworths, he was the heir to the Johansons. He carefully, reverently, folded the brittle paper and tucked it into the pocket of his thin, ragged shirt. It felt like he was carrying a sacred text, a map to a new world. He then turned his attention to the jars on the shelves. He chose one at random, a jar of pickled beets, its contents a deep, vibrant purple even in the faint light. His hands, though still weak, were steady as he worked the sealed lid. When it finally popped open with a soft hiss of released pressure, the sharp, vinegary scent that filled the air was the most beautiful smell he had ever encountered. It was the smell of survival. It was the scent of an answered prayer. He lifted a single, perfect slice of beet from the jar and ate it, the taste exploding on his tongue, a shocking, wonderful sensation. It was more than just food. It was his first act of acceptance, his first taste of a future he now believed he deserved. He made a silent promise in the quiet of that cellar, a vow to the ghosts of the family who had saved him. He would not just survive, he would honor their gift. He would not let their final act of faith be in vain. The cellar was not just a refuge, it was a responsibility. The food would rebuild his body, the blankets would warm him, and the coins he would later find would provide him a path forward in the world. But it was the letter, the simple, handwritten prayer on a yellowed piece of paper, that had truly saved him. It had given him back something the Wadsworths had tried to beat and starve out of him, the belief that his life had meaning. The cellar became his secret world, a subterranean kingdom of hope, where he slowly rebuilt himself. For 2 months he would sneak out of the barn at night, descending into his sanctuary to eat from the Johansons' legacy. With each meal, he felt not only his physical strength returning, but his spirit healing as well. The food filled his belly, but the story of the family who left it filled his soul. He read the letter every single night, the words becoming a catechism of kindness that he knew by heart. He was no longer just hiding from the Wadsworths. He was preparing. He was gathering the strength, not just to escape, but to bring the light of justice into the darkness of that farm. The escape itself, when it came, was not a frantic, fearful flight. It was a deliberate, purposeful departure. He left one moonless night, not with the fear of a runaway, but with the resolve of a messenger. He carried no gold, no silver, only the Johansons' letter and a new document of his own creation. A detailed, damning account of every cruelty, every missed meal, every silent threat he and the other children had endured. He walked the 15 miles to the next town, his steps steady and sure, his mind clear. He was no longer just Josiah, the orphan. He was Josiah, the witness, the keeper of a sacred trust, on a mission to ensure that the prayer for those in need would be answered again. He found Reverend Ezekiel Hartley preparing for his Sunday sermon, a man whose kind eyes had always seemed to see past the grime and fear on the children's faces during his rare visits. Josiah didn't cry or plead. He simply handed the Reverend the 2 letters. As the man read first Josiah's testimony and then the 43-year-old prayer of Eric Johansen, his face transformed from compassion to a steely, righteous anger. The 2 documents, one a record of modern cruelty and the other a testament to historic kindness, created a powerful truth that could not be ignored. The Reverend didn't hesitate. He took the boy in, and together they went to the sheriff. The investigation was swift and decisive. The horrors of the Wadsworth wheat farm were exposed, and Cornelius and Martha were arrested. Their reign of calculated misery brought to an abrupt and final end. The 6 other children were rescued, brought out of the darkness of the barn, and into the light of a world that for the first time seemed to care. The cellar and all its contents were legally awarded to Josiah by the county judge, who was moved to tears by the story of the Johansen family. The gold and silver coins, valued at a sum that seemed astronomical to a boy who had been starved over a bucket of milk, secured his future and his education. In a turn of fate that felt like a final, beautiful stanza in a long and sacred poem, it was discovered that the Reverend's wife, Ingrid, was of Swedish descent. A search of her family's records revealed an impossible, miraculous truth. The Johanssons were her own great-aunt and uncle, a branch of her family thought to have vanished on the prairie decades ago. Josiah was not just adopted, he was welcomed home, brought into the embrace of the very family whose legacy had saved his life. He grew up in a house filled with warmth, learning, and the rumbling laughter of a man who was now his father. He never forgot the cold barn or the gnawing hunger, but those memories were no longer a source of pain. They were a catalyst. He became a lawyer, a fierce and tireless advocate for the rights of the voiceless. He dedicated his life to dismantling the very systems that had allowed the Wadsworths to flourish, shutting down 12 abusive institutions and ensuring that hundreds of children were given the chance at a life they deserved. He kept the Johanssons' letter framed on his office wall for his entire life. It was a constant reminder that the deepest darkness can be illuminated by a single act of faith, and that a prayer, offered with a pure heart, can echo through generations, its power to heal and to save growing stronger with the passage of time. He had been the answer to their prayer, and he spent the rest of his days making sure their legacy of kindness continued to answer the prayers of countless others, proving that no child is ever truly forgotten, and that hope, once planted, can grow even in the most barren and unforgiving soil.